Shortly after the crash of Air India Flight 171 in June of 2025, two U.S. NTSB Blackbox investigation specialists landed in New Delhi, India, to begin their investigation into the crash of an American-made Boeing 787 Dreamliner. However, before the NTSB agents even put their feet on the tarmac, their phones started burning up with urgent text messages from their fellow NTSB and FAA colleagues, warning them that, quote, "The Indians are planning something, so don't go anywhere with the Indians," end quote. And that warning didn't just come out of the blue, but according to a blockbuster Wall Street Journal investigative report, that warning came from the top, the NTSB chair, Jennifer Homenday herself. It all started earlier that day when some members of the NTSB advance team in India were told by Indian authorities that instead of downloading the black box data from Air India's 787 black boxes in the city of Delhi, in a rather strange move, for some reason the Indian officials wanted the U.S. technical experts to take a clandestine late-night flight on a military plane and then drive to a remote area to an off-grid aerospace company's lab. Then, it was there that the U.S. experts were supposedly expected to analyze flight data and cockpit voice recorders pulled from the crashed Air India jet. However, U.S. NTSB Chair Jennifer Homenday and other American officials were so concerned about the safety of U.S. personnel and equipment being taken to a remote location, especially amid State Department security warnings about terrorism and military conflicts in the region, that the NTSB chairwoman made a flurry of calls, including to Sean Duffy, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, as well as the chief executives of Boeing and GE Aerospace. And she also requested that the State Department immediately send embassy officials to intercept the NTSB recorder specialists at the airport, and that the Americans remain in Delhi at all times, where the U.S. security forces can keep an eye on them. And that bizarre account, according to the Wall Street Journal, is accurate and was verified by officials within the U.S. Department of Transportation. And according to the Journal and U.S. officials, that previously unreported and rather strange episode marked a high point of tensions between the Indian government officials who are leading the probe and American officials who are assisting them. And according to interviews with more than a dozen people familiar with the report, since the beginning, the Air India investigation has been marked by points of tension, suspicion, and poor communication between senior officials of the two nations. But the latest revelations by the Wall Street Journal and the U.S. government just highlights the deeper tensions that had been building since the first American investigators arrived in India on June 15. In Ahmedabad, near the crash site, officials from India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, or the AAIB, emphasized that the country was capable of leading a major international probe and had recently opened a modern black box laboratory in Delhi. According to people familiar with the exchange, AAIB Director GVG Yagendhar became quite indignant, telling the Americans, "We're not a third world country. We can do anything you can do." However, U.S. investigators soon grew concerned about what they saw as limited access to vital crash evidence. Then, while at the crash site, American personnel were reportedly prevented from taking photographs, and portions of the wreckage were moved before the NTSB could even investigate or look at the wreckage evidence. The U.S. also said that Indian authorities were progressing sequentially through investigative steps privately, keeping out other agencies that would normally investigate with the home country simultaneously. However, the largest point of frustration for the U.S. side was the apparent delay in downloading the black box data. Without it, investigators had little to explain why both engines of the 787 appeared to lose thrust just seconds after takeoff. It was at that point that U.S. NTSB Chair Jennifer Homenday had had enough. Homenday drafted but ultimately didn't send a letter to India's Civil Aviation Minister, urging that the recorders be processed either in Delhi or at the NTSB's own secure lab in Washington, D.C. Instead, she delivered that message on the phone and warned that the U.S. would withdraw support for India on multiple levels if a decision was not made within 48 hours. It was only then that India agreed to conduct the recorder downloading in Delhi using more than 30 specialized pieces of equipment provided by the NTSB. But it was that resulting data that became the focus of the most sensitive portion of the investigation. That ignited a firestorm of accusations to who was exactly at the fault for the crash. Because as we now know, people familiar with the cockpit voice recorder downloads leaked information that the evidence showed that the fuel cutoff switches were manually moved on both engines 1 second apart, shortly after takeoff. Then about 10 seconds later, the switches were returned to the run position, but the aircraft had already lost sufficient thrust to remain airborne. The flight data recorder also indicated that Captain Sumit Sabrahal did not pull back on the control yoke in the aircraft's final moments, while First Officer Clive Kunder did attempt to raise the nose. Based on additional recordings from air traffic control reviewed by investigators, the captain appeared calm as the situation deteriorated, while the first officer became increasingly distressed. As the Wall Street Journal reported back in July after this information was leaked, that the American government and industry officials have privately concluded that Captain Sabrahal likely moved the fuel cutoff switches, suggesting an intentional act. The NTSB, FAA, Boeing, and GE Aerospace have not publicly stated such a conclusion, but people familiar with their internal assessments say they do not believe a mechanical issue or design flaw caused the accident. Boeing engineers later met with FAA officials and demonstrated how the 787's fuel cutoff switches are designed to be difficult to move accidentally, reinforcing the view among U.S. officials at least that inadvertent activation was unlikely. However, Indian authorities have not drawn any conclusions. As a matter of fact, as I reported earlier in November, that the Indian Supreme Court actually forbade the Indian government from blaming the pilots, even though the investigation hasn't been completed yet. So yeah, you can understand why the U.S. government was worried that the Indian authorities could not be trusted with conducting this investigation on their own. Because it already looks like India may still, indeed, be acting like a third world nation, or so far at least. However, India's preliminary report, released July 11, confirmed that the switches were moved and that one pilot asked the other why he did it, but did not identify which pilot or whether the action was intentional. The report also noted that the switches were returned to run after 10 seconds, adding a layer of ambiguity that investigators expect will be debated for years. As for what comes next, well, the AAIB final report could take a year or more. Investigators will continue analyzing the black box data, cockpit psychology, maintenance records, aircraft systems, crew histories, and simulator testing. They will also examine whether the emergency power system deployment observed on 2 separate flights signals a broader issue and whether any oversight lapses by Air India or regulators played a role. Until then, both governments face pressure to explain how a technologically advanced, widely trusted aircraft fell from the sky moments after takeoff. And families of the victims, along with airlines and regulators worldwide, are waiting for definitive answers that remain elusive, deeply sensitive, and potentially contentious. So what do you think? Can India be trusted to deliver the truth of the cause of the Air India crash? Well, I won't know until you let me know down below.